The patent office, of course, said at the time, everything that has been invented has already been invented, you know. And the physicists of that era, shortly before 1895, they thought they knew just about everything. Then good old Röntgen came out and showed that you could see right through your hand with X-rays. When they first heard about that, they thought it was a hoax. But for 5 years, this was not believed. They were flying in broad daylight in Ohio, on the Huffman Prairie. Reporters saw them. The Army said, prove it on paper to us. They didn't come out to observe it. They tried to sell the patent rights to the U.S. government for $25,000, and they couldn't interest the the Army, the War Department at the time. And it was just an amazing story. If you read Fred Kelly's book on their biography, you will see very similar situations going on. We, of course, know what happened with aviation. It exploded. It led to space travel ultimately and transatlantic flights. By the way, when one of the worst skeptics at the time, who said it could never be done, he proved mathematically that it could never be done. He was a great astronomer. Upon hearing that they had flown, and he had to accept it then, they did it in Fort Myers, Virginia, he said, well, they'll never have a passenger. How wrong he was. Here's another guy who did something small, like Pons and Fleischmann, like the Wright brothers. And by the way, they weren't in the field. There was no field, okay? There was no cold fusion field before Pons and Fleischmann. There was no really aviation field before the original aeronautical underground and the Wright brothers. And there certainly was no space travel field, except for science fiction people and so forth, until Robert Goddard and Tsiolkovsky and Oberth. And Goddard, not too many miles from here, launched in, I believe it was in March of 1926, his little liquid fuel rocket, which led to the whole space age. And at the time, he was called the Moon Man, and was much ridiculed for not understanding physics. New York Times ran an editorial saying he didn't have a high school physics education, but of course he was right. The fact you did not need anything to push against. All right, let's set the context. We are in a serious energy problem here. I've shared some of this with Fred Yeager of Eneco, who's interested in knowing where order of magnitudes are and what's happening. I mean, here's the integrated fossil fuel reserves of the planet projected into the future. It's going to end. There's no doubt about it. In fact, it's going to end our ability to use oil as our population soars to perhaps the 10 billion level, with only an assumption of final rate of consumption of 2/3 of the US rate. We have a huge deficit. We need some other energy sources. And we need them quick, because it's starting to diverge right here. There are energy shortages already. That's why we're having wars and problems, terrible things. I mean, this problem with the seceding Russian province has something to do with energy, to say the least. Okay, I imagine if they were sitting on sand instead of oil, there would be a less of a problem. And of course, if it goes to 15 billion, we have a real problem. Well, the hot fusion people have been trying to solve this problem of using water fuel for a long time. They have giant lasers, or the tokamak system, which we have here at MIT and Princeton and General Atomics. It's a noble effort, always was. However, I would say in the last 4 or 5 years, it's increasingly less noble, in that I think the answer that these former colleagues of mine were striving for, it was on the table for them, but they rejected it for their own paradigm paralysis reasons. They rejected it violently, and I think their serious misfortune will be they won't have a program in the not-too-distant future. I think with the new administration in Congress, I think there are going to be some very big changes in hot fusion funding. But anyway, the controversy erupted, and the hot fusion people reacted negatively. There was much media coverage. On 3 days in 1989, May 8th, unheard of, a scientific device made the cover of a magazine. It also made Newsweek. I don't think I have Newsweek here. Business Week, Time, and Newsweek. And part of the reason it just went was this little party that they had here at MIT. They had a wake for cold fusion. That was kind of, it wasn't just because of that party, but in general, the theme within hot fusion and within the physics establishment was that cold fusion was dead, and they had proved that it couldn't be done. And so they held a wake for it on June 26, '89. And that just shows that what happened in the story, the complexity of it, is that they rushed to judgment. They did not proceed in a scientific way, continuing experiments as many positive people have, and therefore, of course, they didn't find the results. Unfortunately, those results are being used today to show that cold fusion doesn't exist. Well, I wrote a book on cold fusion. I'd like to think of it as the book because it's the only book, at least until this point, that says, apart from Hal Fox's excellent book, one of the pioneers in cold fusion publishing is Hal Fox, Cold Fusion Impact, a great book with a tremendous bibliography. That's also highly positive, as is his newsletter. But I was the first to say that the evidence was overwhelmingly compelling, and I now don't say that anymore. I say it's 100% certain. There's just no doubt about it. But that has led to, because of the negativism, despite my book and Hal Fox's book and radio programs and TV programs, still there is this feeling of derision in the US, and not so in Japan, where it is very, very active. In fact, Julian Schwinger, in his talk, reprinted in the first issue of Cold Fusion magazine, which I have a copy of here. This magazine, which was published at Wayne Green Incorporated in New Hampshire, Peterborough. Schwinger's talk in there, basically, he said in Japan that it would be developed in Japan and not in the West. And he may well be right to some extent. I'd say the thing that will save the United States will be the entrepreneurial spirit in the United States, such as embodied by people in this room, people like Fred Yeager of Eneco, Mitch Swartz of Jet Technology, Hydrodynamics, Jim Griggs, many such people, on and on and on, who refuse to accept what is obviously the unacceptable, namely the thought that cold fusion is nonsense. There is increased media attention to it. August '93 was a major breakthrough when Jerry Bishop, who normally writes for the Wall Street Journal, did this wonderful article in Popular Science on cold fusion. And then an even bigger breakthrough, and a great day for MIT, I think, to kind of take some of the sting off its reputation as a bastion of skepticism, was Technology Review. I don't know if they were supposed to bring copies of their leftover copies of this issue, which is Dr. Storms's wonderful essay about the status of cold fusion. It's shown coming out of the trash can, okay, which I think was an apt description. I give a little credit to my own efforts for this appearance in a way, because in 1991 I had submitted an article which was first accepted and then surreptitiously removed from Technology Review. I'm delighted that Ed got his in, but it was too bad that in '91, when I would have said roughly the same things, they felt that it was too heretical to publish at the time. Maybe they were right. There was a pretty bad eruption, by the way, after this occurred, even in 1994. You can imagine what would have happened in 1991. Let me just give a schematic of the cold fusion problem, if I may.